I thought it'd be timely to release this when the memo in question that created this whole kerfuffle was supposed to come out. So, if you haven't heard, we'll talk about it in more detail, but this here is General Mike Minihan. He had pinned a memo that was supposed to go out on February 1st to Air Mobility Command, the command that he's in charge of, and it got leaked, largely probably for political reasons, and it is very interesting, which is why we're talking about it, but the big whole point of it is General Mike Minihan is concerned that we will be at war with China in 2025. And I thought this would be a good stepping stone to my Chinese crisis video that I've kind of previewed in a couple of other videos. So think of this as the forward to that video, the stepping off point, the introduction, if you will. And take a look at the memo, what Mike Minihan said, what he's concerned about, and really at least let me express my thoughts on the matter, but at least provide you the context of what was actually said and what some of those concerns are based around. You may also notice that the slideshow background has changed. I'm no longer talking about synergy. I thought this is maybe a little cheesy, but I thought it'd fit the topics a little bit better. But you'll see this bounce back and forth between the old style and the style just due to pre-recorded content, so keep that in mind. But why do I talk about this? There's a bunch of different news reports by actual journalists out there, and there have been people like Ward Carroll who have talked about this, bigger YouTubers. Why add my voice to the conversation? Why talk about this? Well, one thing I think a lot of people leave out is they either focus too much on Mike Minihan and not enough on the memo, or just on the memo and not Mike Minihan. So I want to provide you a good basis of both so that you can do more research, because Mike Minihan has been in the news more than once in the last couple of years for statements he's made. The memo itself is very telling in what his thought process is, and we'll take a look at some of his previous comments, because I do think that they steer this more towards maybe a bit of fear-mongering than anything else. It's also important because U.S.-China tension is continually getting worse and worse, or higher and higher, however you want to say it. Of course, the whole question of whether the CCP or the PLA will invade Taiwan, and of course the U.S. with their whole CHIPS thing, the CHIPS Act, and also messing with what the export capability to China is for chips, with the Japanese, and I think Denmark or the Netherlands jumping on board as well, which is a fairly big deal. But this is it's not 1 minute to midnight, obviously. I mean, they did change that recently, but I think a lot of people blow that out of proportion, so I do want to talk about it. And of course, all of this in the light of the Russo-Ukrainian war, how maybe it changes the calculus of that and makes this a maybe less interesting conversation, but we'll talk about it in a minute. So what am I actually going to cover? So we're actually going to look at the memo, the listed concerns. You can find the memo and read it word for word out on the internet. I've got some pictures, but you'll see. We'll take a look at Mike Minihan. We'll take a look at his command, Air Mobility Command, the locations of what a potential conflict would look like, the combatants, so of course Taiwan, possibly the JSDF, Japan's military, the U.S., and of course the People's Liberation Army, the PLA of mainland China, that's effectively the CCP army. The politics of it all, my personal thoughts, credits and thanks, and just people I think are cool, and previews for future episodes. So the memo itself, as you see, was dated for February 1st, which is when this comes out, but this got leaked back, I believe, on January 25th or 26th. So it's been out, making the rounds for a few days now. And there are a couple of things. You can read at least the first page and portions of the second there. It's only 2 pages. But you can find the actual document as well online. So, if you want to read it word for word, go for it. But I'll hit the highlights for you. His first paragraph there, he lists 2 specific dates. 2025 for the actual war. He does this, he mentions 2025 at least, as it would be right after the Taiwanese election and the US election. We'll talk about those both in greater detail in a moment, but both of these are not necessarily rocking the boat in terms of how these two countries view China, right? They're largely going to be the same. The main topics of the day are not centered around China in the US, and the Taiwanese, pretty much all the parties are on kind of the same page, at least the major parties, on how they view the mainland China government, the CCP. It's just how they fight them is a different question. We'll take a look at Xi's War Council in a minute as well, which is also listed here. A lot of people that talk about Taiwan and the CCP talk about Xi's third term and the War Council he's prepared, but no one talks about who these people are. So we'll take a look at the Politburo and see who is actually on the Politburo, what they've done, what they're known for, and some of their kind of outlooks, if you will. And some of his comments here are interesting. So he has a lot. All of this is effectively we're preparing for a war with China in 2025. Totally fine. A lot of the concepts here are not necessarily bad. It's always good to try to be better at what you're doing, especially in light of the stress that we've added with trying to get things to Europe faster, which is going to fall under the purview of Air Mobility Command. But the wording and like the whole first paragraph is weird. And that sets pretty much the whole tone. The entirety of this is largely, hey, we're going to do this very boilerplate, try to be faster at our jobs, try to be more efficient type situation. How they go about doing it, but he adds all this flavor text of, I hope I'm wrong, my gut tells me we will fight in 2025. Xi has secured his third term and set his war council. And then goes on to say, AMC-aligned personnel with weapons qualifications will fire a clip into a 7-meter target with a full understanding that unrepentant lethality matters most. Aim for the head. None of that was necessary. Air Mobility Command, which, once again, I'll go in more detail in a moment, is not a frontline combat unit. Like, of course, pretty much everyone that might possibly be in a combat region will have a sidearm, but like, you have qualifications for this already. Going and firing a full clip into a target and aiming specifically for the head, okay, I guess. But you could have, like, there's a very boilerplatey way to say that, and adding that section with the understanding that everyone who carries a sidearm or will carry one has to have these qualifications anyway, that you don't just get it once, from my understanding, and it's done. You have to, like, fairly regularly, maintain your ability to do that. You have to meet these qualifications. But whatever, throw it in there. So the wording is strange, but having your people brush up on firearm skills is not a bad thing. He also goes in to say we will have regular reporting period. I think he's going to do one of these every month going forward for like the next 8 months or so. And all of his people in his command are going to report to him on their progress. Totally fine. Once again, good idea. Please continue, I guess. But then he also goes on to say, make sure you get your personal affairs in order. So basically, get your will and testament in order, because there's a high likelihood you're going to die. Which, once again, anyone in the military, even if, once again, not a combat unit, but anytime you're working around like heavy machinery or moving really large things, even in the civilian sector, the possibility of being injured or killed while on the job is possible. So having that done isn't a terrible thing, but once again, it's very just odd, right? This seems like a strange thing for a memo right? This almost sounds more like a speech he was going to give and then like didn't get to go to the event, or like he couldn't get enough people from his command all in one room, or at least the people he wanted. So he put it out as a memo to everyone that got leaked, probably from someone on his team, I would imagine. Because it wasn't supposed to go out till today, February 1st. That means someone who had early access to this was like, hey, I'm just going to leak this to a news organization. And it's been in the news for the last few days. So now that we've got that out of the way, what are the two main concerns he had timeline-wise? Well, it's the 2024 election in Taiwan and the U.S. Starting with Taiwan, because it's probably the more important one in this context. Tsai Ing-wen, their current president, has hit her term limit. She cannot run for president again, and their local elections from 2022 did not go her party's way, though she stepped down as the head of the party. Taiwan's a little different politically, and I'm not an expert on this by any means, but in the U.S., you usually take larger elections as indicators possibly for the next cycle. Now, of course, since COVID, things have been a little wacky, but generally you don't look at your mayoral elections as any kind of trend as to what the political leanings, nationally speaking, are going to be. But Taiwan doesn't have that. They don't have like states like the U.S. does. You have effectively North and South Taiwan being fairly politically different. There's a lot of mix in there, obviously, because it's not like a massive island. And then like the kind of more mountainous region is a blend. But your two main parties here are the DPP and the KMT. I believe, if I'm correctly remembering, Tsai Ing-wen's party is the DPP. She stepped down from that because they had lost in this last series of elections for mayoral elections. And that's the next biggest regular political election that happens. So people were saying, oh, maybe the KMT has a chance to kind of sweep in. But one thing I don't think that General Mike Minihan maybe looked at, and once again, he's a general. He's a 4-star general. He has significantly more access to information than I do, but I think that's a double-edged sword because it can sprout a fear of things that may not happen, and it may also breed a little bit of paranoia. Now, once again, more experience in both military, because I've never served, and in life, because he's older than I am, and has access to this information. But generally speaking, regardless if it's the DPP or the KMT in charge at a national level, they both don't have the idea of joining China, right? They don't want to submit to the CCP, but the difference is the favorability of pushing for independence. There is a slight difference there, but once again, the fact remains neither one wants to be subservient to the CCP. If I'm correctly remembering this from what I've read, once again, not a subject matter expert, the DPP is more kind of militarily focused, which is, once again, what Tsai Ing-wen here has been kind of noted for, a military buildup over the last few years. Whereas the KMT is more focused about detaching their economy from the CCP and trying to be a bigger economic force, which could go either way, honestly. But regardless, neither one of these countries, or neither one of these political parties are like, yo, pro-CCP, let's go, boys. They're very much, hey, yeah, we don't want to be part of the CCP. We don't want to be part of mainland China. We're doing our own thing. We want to stay a democracy. And neither one has ever come out in favor of like the one country, two party system like Hong Kong was supposed to have. So sure, there's a shakeup here, but mostly the country is kind of united around this idea of do not get invaded by the CCP. And then you have the U.S. elections. Joe Biden's going to be seeking re-election. He's going to be our oldest president, but usually, even in that instance, incumbent presidents do pretty well. Of course, Donald Trump was a one-term president, and before that, you had George H.W. Bush being a one-term president. But outside of that, in Nixon and Gerald R. Ford and Jimmy Carter, more than I thought. Most presidents are two-term presidents, like for the last, like since World War II. Very good chance the incumbency will benefit him and he'll probably win, but regardless, in terms of China, Joe Biden and kind of the presumptive nominee for the GOP is going to be Donald Trump. Neither one of them are super stoked on China. So maybe it changes from like military assistance to Taiwan to more like economics. But Biden's been doing that anyway with chips. So it's really hard to see the calculus change dramatically. I don't think that either one of these really provide Xi the moment he thinks he'll have in order to invade Taiwan. Both Biden and Trump have been pretty hawkish, maybe not like war-wise, but very economically hawkish, and either of them would probably bust some sanctions down on China if they decided to, with Biden probably lending more military support. Regardless, neither of these are like cataclysmic events that would shake either country dramatically. But then we get to General Mike Minihan himself. So he's been doing a lot in the Pacific, the Asia-Pacific region, or Indo-Pac, the Indian and Pacific Oceans. He's been in that field and fairly high levels, positions since 2007. So he's been there a minute. In 2021, he was promoted to Commander of Air Mobility Command. Shortly thereafter, in September 22, pretty recently, he gave a keynote address at the AFA's Airspace and Cyber Conference that he, I guess, titled, or someone else titled, the Mobility Manifesto. And I wanted to bring this is a clip I've seen people talk about the most, because it shares a lot of the same vibes. It's the same type of language. Lethality matters most. When you can kill your enemy, every part of your life is better. Your food tastes better, your marriage is stronger. Why is the mobility guy talking about lethality? Pause here. Yeah, why, bro? Like, don't get me wrong. You should have the understanding that you're an armed services personnel. You're going to have that kind of possibility come up, but I'm not coming at you as a C-130 driver. I'm not coming at you as a mobility officer. I'm coming at you like an airman, like Rickenbacker, like Mitchell, like LeMay, Olds, Levitow, and Saigen. This is who we are. We are lethal. Do not apologize for it. The pile of our nation's enemy dead, the pile that is the biggest, is in front of the United States Air Force. This is why we mutinied in 1947. So you're talking about the creation of the Air Force there, by the way, in 1947. This language shares very similar tendencies to this memo. A lot of imagery kind of trying to put himself more in like this tough guy pilot mode, which, you know, he is a pilot. He's flown C-130s. So, you know, he is a pilot. He has been in the air. But once again, he's not an F-16 pilot. He's not an ace pilot. He's not a combat pilot. Or, you know, I don't want to denigrate that, but you would think someone that's primary focus is trying to make sure supplies get places, who is largely more in the business of logistics, would be a little bit more concerned about efficiency than lethality. Now, of course, by extension, being able to provide those supplies, you know, the lethality of that force, it's fine. But this is what I would typically classify as very hawkish language. This is the type of stuff you would see from typically more hawkish countries. So you see a lot of high-ranking Chinese military officials say similar types of stuff to this. If, you know, a lot of higher-up Russian commanders were at war right now, they would be saying very similar things to this. This isn't necessarily inherently saying this guy's bad, right? I'm just saying that for someone in this position to have a memo leak like this is not a great look, and almost feels like, it's not the thought that counts, right? You need to be effective at your job in this position. You need to make sure that you're conveying to your people, the people in your command, this is what we're doing, this is how we do it. And this feels like he's trying to give like a battlefield speech or like a halftime speech, which is, fine, different leadership styles, but this is just provides me slightly more skepticism to the perception this man shares, or sees, rather, about China. So what is Air Mobility Command? Because I've danced around this topic for a minute. They do airlift, they do air-to-air refueling, and aeromedical evacuations. Aeromedical evacuations possibly could see combat. Except these aeromedical evacuations, being part of the Air Force, are less of like medevac from like helicopters, right? Those are usually not the case here. This is, we're transporting people to a more advanced medical facility, which is fine. But usually any of your larger aircraft that do that are going to be in a fairly safe place. Air-to-air refueling is the same thing. Your tankers are not going to be near a combat zone, ideally. And airlift, once again, your larger airlift-capable aircraft are not going into contested airspace. They're landing at safe, secure airfields. So, this is a very important command, right? Airlift is vital, as is air-to-air refueling and aeromedical evacuation. But this doesn't really have a strong, this is not a frontline combat unit. And having this rhetoric about you need to fire a full clip into a target named for the head is odd. It feels very much of he wanted to be in charge of a combat unit. He's got the language for it, but he's in Air Mobility Command. So, yeah, that's what it is. I mean, once again, I'm not trying to denigrate. The man is much more experienced in all of this than I am. He has a lot more information. But I do think it is important that we look at these things and can be skeptical of them. Because regardless of how many stars you have, it doesn't inherently make you 100% right and free of any kind of criticism or skepticism even. So, once again, not trying to insult the man, but it is important we voice these criticisms and skepticisms. So, location. This is important. Any fight with China is probably going to be over Taiwan, let's be honest. However, the Taiwanese Strait's pretty big. It's a little over 100 miles wide. That's a pretty hard place to invade, especially in today's area, today's technological landscape. There we go. Words are hard right now, guys. I'm sorry. More likely than not, if we saw an invasion of Taiwan, especially pre-Russian invasion of Ukraine, it would be one of the closer island chains to mainland China, like Kinmen, Matsu, or Wixiao. Probably pronounced that wrong. I'm going to pronounce a lot of things wrong. I'm very sorry about that. Possibly even Pingyu, but that's so close to Taiwan that you would see any of this coming, right? Now, of course, you could try to do the fake-out thing like the Allies done at D-Day, but it's a lot easier. Once again, D-Day, not easy. Massive undertaking. But it's easier to do something like that when you don't have almost constant satellite surveillance on the area, plus the radar capabilities of Taiwan and any US or Japanese assets in the area. Wild. But regardless, this is not something that's going to be a sneak attack, right? The Chinese don't really have the capability to operate for prolonged periods past the first island chain, and they're definitely not taking transport ships to try to hit the other side of the island. which would be the only real surprise attack you could do. Now, if they took some of the outlying islands before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, they might have got away with it. It might have been a Crimea situation. However, at this point, I think the Russians have spoiled that for the Chinese. Any of those islands would mean a lot more would happen, and probably maybe not like an invasion, wouldn't necessarily result in military action, but you would see some pretty hefty sanctions. And at this point, I'll make a much more expanded argument in my China crisis video that I'll do in the future, which this is the prelude to. The Chinese economy is not nearly as resilient to those types of sanctions as the Russian is. The Russian economy is largely raw material export. Whether it's foodstuffs, whether it's fuel, oil, natural gas, or raw metals, materials, things like that. They're really relatively able to survive, right? Which is why sanctions, while they've impacted the Russian capability, economically speaking, have not crippled the economy. China is a value-added economy. They get a bunch of raw materials in, they put them into whatever they're trying to make. A lot of times it's end product, so it's going to the user, it's going to market, with their top markets being the US and Europe. So if you take out the two top markets of mainland China, their economy does not have the ability to sustain even if Russia and India work as a stopgap, because they do not have the capability of consumption that the US and Europe does. So sanction packages are a lot scarier to mainland China than they are to Russia. Now, the Taiwanese Strait and the area where D-Day occurred are about the same width, so theoretically speaking, it can be done. However, the Taiwanese Strait, generally speaking, is rougher seas, from my understanding. And once again, there is surveillance everywhere. So this would not be something that you could even try to, pull a fast one. This is not a fast jaunt across the strait. It's a fairly difficult journey, especially if you're trying to take a ton of landing craft across with their warship escorts. Now, of course, Taiwan has their own navy. The U.S. Navy operates in the area consistently. And then you have the Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force, plus any other allied ships in the region. The Taiwanese Strait is much more difficult to operate in than that of the English Channel, and there's a lot more naval power contention in the area than there was at that point in World War II. But let's look at the combatants. What are we looking? What are we rocking? What kind of equipment are we looking at? So Taiwan has a reasonably sized navy. They're a small country, so they don't have a massive navy, right? They don't have any carrier strike groups rocking. But they do have a lot of repurposed equipment from the US, from France, and have kind of made their own upgrades along the way. So these are older ships, but they're still competent, right? If they're there just to hazard or harass, I guess is the word I was looking for, any incoming vessels, they're doing their job. Their current standing army is about 130 personnel. That's not purely combat personnel, but like we saw with Ukraine, that number balloons very quickly when everyone on your street gets a gun or makes Molotovs. And this has been something the Taiwanese have been working on and looking at for the last 60 years, right? There's always been the looming threat of the CCP invading, and they've been building their defenses accordingly. Their Air Force is it's very similar to their Navy. It's a little outdated, but it's still very capable. So they've got a fair few F-5 Tiger IIs, F-16 Fighting Falcons or Vipers, depending who you ask. The FCK-1 Qingqiao, which is their indigenous fighter, that is an interesting mix of an F-16 and F-18. It's a very interesting aircraft I want to talk about one day, but they have a fair few of those as well. They have Mirage 2000s from France, E2 Hawkeyes, so they actually have a more capable short-range AWACS capability than that of the Chinese, although they are working on a copycat of the E2. And they also have the P3 Orion for their maritime operations. Then you have Japan, which maybe wouldn't be a direct combatant because of their constitution, but they've been showing a lot of willingness lately to position pieces of equipment like missile defense systems much, much closer to Taiwan. And the Taiwanese are pretty stoked about it. So even if they don't actually partake in combat, they can absolutely provide security for any U.S. supply trains, or supply ships rather, kind of serve as escorts and would be very capable at that. And in terms of naval power, Japan's, it's not the U.S., but it is definitely close. Like, I'd say it's definitely a top 5 navy in the world. Anyway, the general ship layout of the JMSDF, or the Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force, you have the Izumo and Hyuga class helicopter destroyers, which are the ships that the F-35Bs are kind of testing operations off of, so it's kind of like a light escort carrier, if you will. They have the Azumi class landing ship, which is more like a landing assault ship, as far as like a U.S. context goes, for comparison. You have the Maya, Atago, and Kongo class Aegis missile destroyers. So these are very similar to the Arleigh Burke classes, but upgraded via Japan as opposed to like the Flight 3s that the U.S. uses. Then you have the Ashai, the Akazuki, the Takanami, the Murasame class destroyers, and then the Mogami class frigates. That one is much more advanced from like a sensor standpoint, from my understanding. But regardless, all of these are very capable, very modern ships by most comparisons. The JSDF also has their Amphibious Rapid Deployment Brigade. Well, Japan is a series of islands. Having a Rapid Deployment Brigade that is familiar with amphibious landings, pretty important if you're trying to back up or provide security to the Taiwanese. And then, of course, the JASDF, which is the Japanese Air Self-Defense Force, has their 9th Air Wing based out of Naha Air Base in Okinawa, with their J-15Js, or F-15Js, or DJs, so it's the F-15C or D, but the Japanese variant. And, of course, they also use P-3 Orions and EP-3C Orions for their maritime operations. And then, of course, you have the U.S. The U.S. Navy has Carrier Strike Group 5 based out of Yokosuka. Right now, their flagship is the CVN-76 USS Ronald Reagan. I don't foresee that changing. I haven't heard any rumors or anything of that changing anytime soon. But anything is possible. I've seen some reports over the last 2 years or so, since the pandemic at the least, of some weird maintenance things. I think there's air fuel leaking into some of the water supply at one point, but I haven't heard anything about it since. I assume it's hopefully been fixed, or the sailors on board are going to have a much rougher time. It's an older Nimitz class. It's kind of getting up there, showing its age, but still a very capable aircraft carrier, and has a large air wing in and of itself. You have the Ticonderoga class cruisers, as well as the Arleigh Burke class destroyers. The actual ships can change from time to time, and of course, if anything is in for repair or something like that, or it's at the end of its tour. Yeah, it's hard to say, but generally, those are what accompany, of course, some smaller service vessels and maybe submarines, depending on what they're trying to do. Then, of course, you have the Marines based out of Okinawa as well, with the 3rd Marine Expeditionary Force, as well as the 1st Marine Aircraft Wing, with FA-18Cs and Ds. I specified only Ds, but they may have some single-seat Cs as well, and F-35Bs. And then the Air Force also has a base in Okinawa, with the 18th Air Wing with F-15Cs and Ds. I believe the Japanese are positioning some of their F-35s, or the Air Force might be positioning some in Okinawa as well, but I'm not 100% sure on that. Plus F-22s, B-2s, I think B1s are all based relatively in range, either from Alaska with refueling or from Guam or the Philippines. So you have a lot of strength there that can be brought to bear very quickly. But then you have the Chinese side of things, the CCP. So the PLAN, or the People's Liberation Army Navy, has their Eastern Sea Fleet, which would probably be the primary combatant if they were to invade Taiwan. They have the Type 75 landing helicopter dock, which is, once again, kind of the light escort carrier, but they don't really have anything that's capable of taking off from it right now, other than helicopters. They have the Type 52D and Type 52C destroyers, as well as some of the older legacy Soviet Silver and Mini classes. They have the Type 54A and Type 54 frigates, the Type 53H3 and the Type 53H1G class frigates as well, and the Type 56 corvettes. You also have the People's Liberation Army, based out of the Eastern Theater Command. The 72nd and 73rd Army Groups have the 5th, 124th, 14th, and 91st Amphibious Combined Arms Brigades. So these would be the forces most likely making a landing attempt, if any were to, outside of maybe some paratrooper red elements. And then you have the People's Liberation Army Air Force with the, once again, the Eastern Theater Command. They all generally kind of have the capability to reposition if needed, especially for an operation like this. But you have the H-6, which is their larger bomber aircraft, the J-10 and J-11, the J-16 and J-20. The J-20 being their new stealth aircraft, which is kind of the next closest contemporary to the F-22 and F-35. The J-11 and J-16 are Chinese updates to older Soviet designs, the Su-27s, and the J-10 is another one of their indigenous designs as well. All capable, but they don't have a lot of J-20s, and, you know, if they're kind of betting it all, they might use them. But one thing they do lack, which hampers their ability to operate past the first island chain, is naval AWACS support. They do have a larger land-based AWACS system, but they don't have anything comparable to the E-2. Once again, like I said, they're working on a copycat of it right now, but from what we understand, it's not been fielded yet. Now, of course, they could still have their AWACS operating in-country and still get a fairly clear picture of what's happening, but it's going to be a mess regardless if that many aircraft are going up in the air. So what about politics? What is this war council everyone keeps blathering on about? Do we have a reason to be concerned? Well, yeah, maybe. It's hard to say. From a Western standpoint, getting clear information out of the CCP in particular, but out of China in general, is difficult. One thing, there are a couple of things we can put a little bit more merit into, though. The second in command, Li Qing, hopefully I pronounced that right, is the pro-business guy. This is the guy that is, like, he's not come out and been like, yo, Jack Ma's the coolest guy alive, but he's very friendly with Jack Ma, which the CCP generally is not. But he is much more open to the idea of keeping China an economic power, which requires being open to the West, which necessitates having access to the US and European markets, meaning you can't really do anything that's going to really hamper that relationship. He's been there for a while. He's been pushing this idea, I believe, since like 2012. So he's been out and about doing things, really building those relationships, and he's in a very prominent position. Now, whether or not he gets overruled is hard to say, but having someone like that doesn't really see the economic benefit of taking Taiwan is pretty important in the large scheme of things, and I think it should be noted. You have Xiao Lij. Nothing really of note. Once again, very limited information. I'm sure he has done things, but from my understanding, he's not been like in charge of any large programs or any like specific ideas, like being very pro-Western, pro-business, or things like the Belt and Road, like with Wang Ying. Big prominent thinker on Belt and Road, was one of the big pushers of this. and Belt and Road's not been really doing super hot lately. So, once again, kind of more of an economic kind of relationship building guy, but focused more towards kind of China to Africa, right? So kind of hitting all the smaller countries in between, putting this investment out, being foreign investment into these smaller communities that really wouldn't be as affected by sanctions, but if your main economic drivers start to get hampered, you don't have the ability for foreign investment nearly as much. So, it is what it is. There is actually a really interesting thing going on right now. I can't remember which country it is, but an African country I think is about to go into default on their loans that were largely done via Belt and Roads. The CCP holds a lot of those. And I think there was restructuring negotiations, but depending on how that plays out could really impact how Belt and Road is perceived in the future. And then you have Kai King, who's the head of the Beijing Olympics, the Winter Olympics in 2022, and was also the lead in the Jifandi market. Hope I pronounced that right. That is the market that like 90% of Beijing's food comes from. So while it's not like a huge market, it's an incredibly important one. So once again, not really indicative of much, but this guy has a lot of trust from Xi because she's like, hey, make sure my food doesn't have COVID. Now, as far as like the hawkishness on any of these people towards Taiwan, they probably all kind of share the party line. But if there's something else to combat that, another opinion they may have, whether it's, their dealings with Belt and Road and the economic benefits there, or being very pro-business and trying to kind of take over the world from an economic standpoint, it makes the calculus very different. Then you have Ding Zhijing and Li Ji. Not sure as far as like any really notable programs they've been headed up. But once again, they're powerful political people in China. They're on the Politburo. They're important CCP members. They've done things. I'm just not particularly aware of any like big headline grabbing things. And not pictured here is General Li Xiaoxing and General Liu Zenili. These are kind of the top two dogs of the People's Liberation Army Council. There's actually like a formal name. I can't remember what it is. But it's the governing body of the People's Liberation Army. China's army is set up very different than like the U.S.'s, where the U.S. Army falls under the purview of the president. He's the commander-in-chief. He's the civilian oversight. The CCP has like a war council, but it doesn't actually like lord over the PLA. What kind of happens, from my understanding, is the CCP has their council, the PLA has their council, they kind of meet and intermingle, and the idea was to keep them separate. So if the leadership of the CCP ever became corrupt, the People's Liberation Army could liberate. Was kind of the whole point. They kind of keep the continual revolution alive. This is a very kind of old school Mao sentiment. But what has happened over the years, especially since the fall of the Soviets and bringing China into the WTO, and Nixon meeting and kind of opening China up a little bit from like a diplomatic standpoint, is those two parties have effectively meshed, right? They're still separate in principle, but there's a lot of overlap, and typically it's not a big deal until you get to like a party congress like what's pictured here, and then you kind of have to resign from one or the other so that you can operate on the other one, which is why you see some military people there, but it's not stacked with them. But these two generals here are very hawkish on Taiwan. So it's important to note that they don't make the ultimate decision necessarily. Like, they could operate on their own, but it would not be a good look. And it would be very problematic for them, as there's a lot of things that the Politburo could probably do to those individuals. So that, there is still this kind of implication that Xi would be the final decision on it. But theoretically speaking, I guess they could do it if they wanted to, but they would be viewed as rogue. But these people are it. This is the War Council. Excuse me. You have some people that are relatively warm to the international arena, right? You know, none of these people are coming out and saying, yo, the U.S. is sick, let's be best friends, but they're very aware that in order for us to continue our economic prospering, we need to be able to access markets. In order to bring that money in and reinvest it into Belt and Road, to be influential in these developing countries, we need that capital. And if we hit with sanctions, we don't get that capital anymore. Part of the calculus, which is what brings me to my personal thoughts. Is this a real threat? Well, from a practical standpoint, naval invasions were hard to begin with, but not being able to surprise or fake out whoever you're invading makes them significantly more difficult, right? The Germans were still vaguely prepared for D-Day, but they're not Taiwan prepared, right? Taiwan has been spending most of their time the last 60 years just preparing for this and have at least some of the more advanced battle-tested systems that the U.S. and the Western world has to offer. So from a practical standpoint, it's possible, but it would be a very difficult, very costly invasion if they did pull it off successfully. Which leads me to their war goals. What is the actual point, right? And everyone talks about Taiwan and say, oh, the Chinese are going to take it back because it's an internal matter, which would be a political win for them. But once again, going back, the U.S. would not sleep on this. At the very least, you'd be looking at sanction packages, and with how things with the Russian-Ukraine war have happened, most of Europe's going to fall in line as well. Those are the two largest markets the Chinese export to for most of their goods. It's not their entire economy, but it makes up a large portion of it. So, sure, you get a political win, but it doesn't do you any favors at home, right? Your diplomatic relations with most of the developed world are not irreparable, but very heavily damaged. And then your economic relationships are even worse. If you can't export the goods you're making, even if you could get the slack taken up by India and Russia, which Russia's really not in a great consumption state right now anyway, you're going to just have a lot of leftover stuff. And one of the big things that the CCP likes to really push is this whole everyone gets a job, right? The job placement rate is super high, which is largely why we have the pictures and images of these kind of just ghost towns and ghost cities, but also these very high-tech, high-speed rail lines in the middle of nowhere. They have to keep people at work. If your economy tanks, unless you're going to make a big push for reclaiming land for agricultural purposes or really try to boost consumption internally, which is near impossible for the amount of buying power that the U.S. and Europe have, you're going to be in a real rough state economically speaking. Now, outside of that, say it's a political win, but what about a geostrategic standpoint? Maybe it's a staging ground for the Pacific at large. They really want to start operating more in the Pacific, get past the first island chain for no real reason, right? I mean, don't get me wrong, having the ability to operate past the first island chain for an extended period is a really powerful thing as far as your power projection goes. The problem is that the vast majority of the islands in the South China Sea and the South Pacific already have allegiances, right? Most of them either operate from alliances with the U.S., Australia, the Five Power Defense Agreement, I think is what it's called. It's the Commonwealth, effectively, or the Pacific Island Forum. There's a whole host of organizations that most of these islands already exist in. So sure, you could put some power projection there, but you're not going to be able to outpace a carrier strike group. Even if you can field a very similarly sized one, the U.S. has like anywhere from 3 to 5 operating at a time. So, sure, I think you're probably better off trying to patrol the South China Seas as it's a major trade lane for you, but you want to operate into the kind of void of the Pacific, go for it. And then another point that people like to make, I don't know why I did this in reverse order, but I did, are chips, high-end semiconductors. The Chinese do not have the capability to do it, which is why the whole CHIPS Act and these export embargo or export bans are such a big deal. The Chinese have tried multiple initiatives over the years to produce their own indigenous high-end semiconductors and have failed to do so on multiple occasions. So maybe they take Taiwan for that. Maybe that's just an added benefit. But TSMC is part of an area being invaded, so a stray missile, a stray artillery round, gunfire, a tank shell, anything could severely damage these facilities. And past a certain point, you're not able to repair them, especially if you don't have the expertise in the field, right? Making chips is not like, oh, I work on a Ford, I can work on a Chevy. It's, oh, I know how to tune my lawnmower to, I know how to work on a Ferrari, basically. Like, you're in the same ballpark, but you're Little League versus MLB, right? Weird to use a sports analogy for a sport I don't watch, but it is what it is. But yeah, so even if you took the facility, you don't have the personnel that know how to do it, and most of your high-end personnel are absolutely going to be out of the country well before you invade. So even if you don't damage the facility, you take it with little resistance, and the U.S. doesn't retaliate, you don't have the people. Now, maybe a decade or so you can learn, and maybe it works. But you don't know how to repair the equipment either. So all of these are, people put them out, and sure, wars have been started for dumber reasons. But none of these really make sense when you look at them. And it kind of almost points to, if they do it, it's a very Argentina-Falkland situation. We need a political win at home. This is a way to do it. The British probably aren't going to react, or in this instance, the Americans. And then you get stomped, right? I'm not saying that would happen to China. Like, it'd be a much more difficult fight, obviously. The Chinese are much more capable militarily than the Argentinians were. But there's no real payoff, which is also why, Hong Kong was slightly different because there was a set date, right? But the Chinese kind of did what they were going to do there. They were never really going to invade until, it's ours. We can kind of do with it as we please. The rest of the world's not going to do much. So Hong Kong kind of, in a weird way, ends up being their Crimea, right? Taiwan or any of its outlying islands are not going to be that. At the very least, sanctions are going to hit much harder than they did on Russia. And will it cause the Western world pain? Sure. For a short period of time. 5 years. But production lines in the U.S., Mexico, to an extent Canada, Germany, France, it'll spin up pretty quick. So it's one of those things that, sure, it could happen, but I really personally don't really see it being nearly as relevant as most people think. So my credits. Who am I thinking here? Well, The Hill and their reporting on the U.S. General predicts country will be at war with China in 2025, reporting by Julia Shapiro. The War Zone at The Drive, Air Mobility Command boss predicts war with China in 2025, and Dire Memo by Joseph Trevich. Sorry, no, I pronounced that wrong. Airforce.military or AMC.airforce.military for biographies on General Mike Minihan, as well as the Air Mobility Command. Forbes, one of these 7 people is likely to win Taiwan's high-stake presidential vote in 2024, Gallup pollster says, from Russell Flannery. You can also find the previous comments that General Mike Minihan's made on his mobility manifesto at airandSpaceForces.com. You can also find it other places, but that's where I found the transcript that I read, as well as just general Wikipedia stuff. And then, of course, YouTube channels I like. I should have put it first. Ward Carroll has done a breakdown on this as well from a more traditional, like what you would expect commanders to say. So there's like a really great video he's done on that like super recently, like today, which is like yesterday or the day before when you're watching this, if you're watching it when it comes out. But Breaking Points is always good, and Realignment podcast for like some geopolitical stuff or just like regular news. The Realignment always likes to bring on interesting or weird people that write books, which is also like how I also kind of found out about Peter Zion, my like book writing spirit animal. Operations Room, Perun, Battle Order, Animarchy History, Laser Pig, Chieftain, Red Effect, and Military Aviation History. All that to say, the upcoming Chinese crisis eventually will come out. I don't know a specific date, and like I said, I've been shuffling my schedule around, so sorry for any confusion. I'll go back to 11th and 25th after this video, but since it was the first, I thought it'd be funny to put it out on the first. But yeah, this is going to be kind of the second part to this video, if you will, where I examine China from a domestic standpoint and why I don't think that they have the incentive to do an invasion outside of maybe like a small political win. But anyway, let me know in the comments down below if I've missed anything or anything is incorrect, or if you just have different thoughts on the memo or Taiwan. I'd love to hear what you guys have to say, so I can, talk with you guys. It's always fun to conversate down in the comments. But anyway, I've been Cody. Thanks for sticking with me for about an hour. I'll see you in the next one.